9,000. Oh hey, I didn't see you there. Welcome to the gender section of our video series. I'll be teaching you about the evolution of women's rights and opportunities over multiple decades of American history. Let's begin. In the years leading up to the Gilded Age, there was increasing demand among American women for access to the same higher education opportunities available to men. And in 1833, Oberlin Collegiate Institute became the United States' first coeducational institution of higher learning. Soon afterwards, Mount Holyoke College became the nation's first all-women's college. And by the 1870s, the belief that women were entitled to college educations was fairly widespread and accepted, especially in the West. Many schools began opening their doors to women, granting them a plethora of opportunities that they had not enjoyed before. The Gilded Era was also a critical period of time in the push for women's suffrage. Prominent activists like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton led women in a movement to earn the right to vote. In a speech in 1873, Anthony compared the struggle of women against tyrannical men to the plight of African American slaves against their owners earlier in the century, citing how both women and slaves lacked control over their own lives. In the same speech, she drew on evidence from the Declaration of Independence and from other common beliefs of the founders of the United States.
The women, dissatisfied as they are with this form of government that enforces taxation without representation, that compels them to obey laws to which they have never given their consent, that imprisons and hangs them without a trial by a jury of their peers, that robs them in marriage of the custody of their own persons, wages, and children, are this half of the people left wholly at the mercy of the other half, in direct violation of the spirit and letter of the declarations of the framers of this government, every one of which was based on the immutable principle of equal rights to all.
The women's suffrage movement, in which Anthony and Stanton played a tremendous role, flourished during the Progressive Era. By 1900, over half of the states in the nation had allowed women to vote in local elections that dealt with educational issues. 4 states, Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, and Utah, had granted all their female inhabitants full suffrage. The popularity of the suffrage movement also greatly increased during the Progressive Era. In 1893, there were a mere 13,000 members of the National Women's Suffrage Association, and by 1917, there were more than 2 million. Although during this time there was certainly an expansion of women's political rights, their economic liberty was fairly restricted. They were barred from certain jobs, and their wages were typically different from those of men. Demands for remedies to these inequalities, as well as desires for increased freedom in sexual expression and reproductive choice, became integral parts of the definition of an ideology called feminism that rose to prominence among women of the Progressive Era. Feminists challenged traditional female gender norms and consequently expanded the American cultural perspective on female personal freedom. Feminists like Emma Goldman, who emigrated from Lithuania as a child, toured the nation speaking to crowds of adoring women about topics that included anarchism, homosexuality, and the right of women to birth control. She even gave out informational pamphlets about methods of contraception to those who attended her lectures. Due to the inflammatory nature of her speeches, she was arrested many times simply to keep her from speaking. Emma Goldman epitomized the spirit of a feminist during the Progressive Era. Bold, demanding of her rights, and often criticized and even arrested for her liberality, which was labeled radical by her opponents. The Progressive Era later developed into a new popular type of modern woman in the beginning of the Roaring Twenties. This new modern woman was the flapper, an unapologetically liberal woman donning a short haircut and short skirt. The flapper smoked, drank, used birth control, and thus epitomized the increased freedom women had gained in the Progressive Era and Roaring Twenties through their liberal expression and conduct. The fact that women gained the right to use birth control largely was due to the advocacy of women like Margaret Sanger, who later founded Planned Parenthood. In a debate about the right of women to use birth control, Sanger argued, we have few principles of life by which we must live, and I claim that every one of us has a right to health, to liberty, and to the pursuit of happiness. I say furthermore that birth control is an absolutely essential factor in our living and having those 3 principles of happiness. Like Susan B. Anthony, Margaret Sanger also used evidence from the Founding Fathers of the United States to advocate for granting more rights to women. Another expansion of women's freedom during the 20s was when the United States finally ratified the 19th Amendment in 1920 and became the 27th nation to grant total suffrage to its female citizens. Along with the new ability to vote, women also experienced an increased economic opportunity during the 20s. In 1920 specifically, over 8 million women worked for wages. Another expansion of women's freedom during the 20s was when the United States finally ratified the 19th Amendment in 1920 and became the 27th nation to grant total suffrage to its female citizens. Along with now being able to vote, women also experienced an increase in economic opportunity during this era. In 1920, over 8 million women worked for wages. Opportunity only increased upon the United States' entry into World War II. When American men were drafted into battle, women took over a significant portion of the nation's workforce. In 1944, women accounted for 1/3 of the civilian working population, and 350,000 more served in auxiliary military units. Unlike in the past, when jobs for women were almost always limited to clerical and service positions, the door was open to women in the 1940s to occupy industrial, government, and professional jobs as well. Although conditions between men and women in the United States have certainly become far more equal than they were in the Gilded Age or the Roaring Twenties, there are still some places where the United States falls short in terms of gender equality. For example, the median salary of women working in full-time year-round positions in the United States is only 77% of that of men working for the same amount of time. Parallels can also be drawn between the United States' delay in granting women equality to men in terms of suffrage and its current delay in granting homosexual couples equality to heterosexual couples in terms of marriage. In both instances, the party with fewer rights, women and homosexual couples, only ask for equality to others, not special privileges. Unfortunately, the voting population of the United States has not demonstrated that it has learned from the country's past mistakes, and it continues to oppress certain minority groups by not allowing them the same rights that are taken for granted by others. Thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something interesting from the women's section of our video. To learn more about the evolution of Americans' rights and opportunities according to class or race, click here. If you've already watched the other sections and are finished with our video series, click here to view the conclusion.